Hello everyone and welcome to Marking the Role. This is episode 33. My name's Phil Dye, I'm your host. This is the last in season 6. We'll be back in a few weeks' time in the fourth term in Australia with another 4 episodes. And this is a big week in Australia because it is the first time that a national free-to-air TV station has been brave enough to put on a program that tells the truth about gender transitioning of school-age young people in their program called Spotlight on Channel 7 last Sunday night. And they're no doubt getting heaps and heaps of flack from activists for that. But thank you to journalist Liam Bartlett for having the courage to come out and tell the truth about what is actually happening to young people in this country. And this episode is very much connected to that. This is one of the only episodes we've had that is directed at parents. Yes, it is relevant to teachers, but it's mainly for parents. And it is on how to protect your child from the dangerous gender ideology that's being preached in schools in Australia. It's worse in Victoria, but it's going Australia-wide. Now, this podcast is not anti-trans at all, but we certainly are against the gender transitioning of people under the age of 18. We know in Australia that young school-age people are being fed puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in order to change gender, and that has lasting repercussions on their lives. Internationally, it's become such a big issue that September 14 has been named as Unteach the Overreach Day, where parents are asked to keep their child at home to protest about this intrusion of gender ideology into schools. And many parents are very, very concerned because it's taking what used to be the place of mum and dad to explain to the kids what's happening, these difficult things in the world about gender and about homosexuality, about lots of things, and it's now been taken over by schools. Not just by the school, but by third-party providers that go into the school and are approved by NESA and by the E-Safety Commission to do this. And a lot of parents are simply not happy. And as you will hear from my guests, while it might look great on the surface, and the topic areas, yes, they're pretty necessary and useful, the devil is in the detail. It's in the activities that the kids are given, it's in the case studies and the scenarios. So it's often hidden away in the background, this gender ideology stuff that you have to be very careful of. I thought we'd start this off with a recording that some students took from Rye College in the UK. And this is where they are having a disagreement with the teacher who's teaching them all about gender ideology. And they come out pretty well, actually. Have a listen. And I apologise for the quality of the audio, but one of the kids was recording it from his phone in his pocket.
How dare you? You've just really upset someone. Saying things like, should be in an asylum.
I didn't say that. I just said if they want to identify as a cat or something, then they're like genuinely unwell.
Then they've gone
they're crazy.
You were questioning their identity.
No, I wasn't a question. I was just saying about the gender. I didn't say anything about them.
But where did you get this idea from? There's only 2 genders.
That is my opinion.
If I respect their opinion, can't they respect my opinion?
It is not an opinion.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
but
It's not an opinion you can have.
There's
only a boy and a girl.
Literally. There's no other private part. There's only 2.
Gender is not linked to the parts that you were born with. Gender is about how you identify, which is what I said right from the very beginning of the lesson.
I just don't agree with that. So why should I have to listen to
biological sex, there is actually 3 biological sexes, because you can be born intersex. You can be born with male and female body parts or hormones.
Yeah.
Did you know that? Yeah, there's 3. I'm talking about biological sex. In terms of gender, there are lots of genders. There is transgender. There is agender, people that don't believe they have a gender at all.
Yeah, but you can't have that.
You can't have that. It's not a law.
Yeah, but it's not a law, but it's our opinion. We just don't agree with it. We just think it's all just...
If you have a vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy.
Yeah.
But cisgender is not necessarily the way to be. You are talking about the fact that cisgender is the norm. That you identify with the gender of the sexual order that you're born with or you're with. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah.
Which is really despicable.
How? When it's
If I called my mum right now, my mum would be on my side.
If I called my mum, she'd say.
Well, that's very sad as well then.
How is it?
Loads of people agree with that. There's only a small majority of people who actually think that.
And why do you think we have so many problems in the world with homophobia? Because
That's
of
not
people
homophobia,
expressing-
that's gender.
Yeah.
Yes,
I'm
it
fine
is.
with lesbians and gay people.
Same.
I've got nothing against them.
Yeah, same.
But gender there is a link between it, and you're saying that people
There
can't
isn't.
change
No, they
who they want
can't.
to be.
They can't. Unless you
You're
get a
so
penis
wrong.
attached. No, I'm not.
You're confusing sex and gender.
No, I'm not though. Because
Yes,
if you have a
you are.
vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy.
Yeah.
Even then, because you've got those
How
genes.
you identity.
I just
How you
don't agree with
identify.
it.
Yeah,
But
just
it's not an opinion that
Yes,
we
it is.
express in this
Yes,
school.
it is.
No, it's not. And if you don't like it, you need to go to a different school. So
I did go to a
I'm
different
reporting you to Miss Willis. You need to have a proper educational conversation about equality, diversity and
I ain't
inclusion.
doing it. My mum
Because
doesn't
I'm
let
not
me do that.
having that expressed in my lesson. When I'm teaching you about you can be who you want to be,
Everyone else
how
thinks
you
that.
identify is up to
So
you.
Everyone else thinks it. They just don't say it because then all this happens.
Maybe because they're polite and maybe they're sensitive.
I haven't said anything in all of the lessons I've been in. It's just because they turned around and started saying something. So I said, how can you identify as a cat when you're a girl?
But
Yeah.
they're now writing a statement. I would imagine that you'll be asked to write a statement as well.
We will.
Yeah, we will.
And gee, I think Miss Willis better read some biology text, because even if you do identify as a cow, that little girl is still a girl. And gee, I better correct that teacher, because there's not 3 sexes. I used to teach about intersex at the University of New South Wales. And intersex is not a sex at all. It's when people are born with characteristics of both sexes. And often that irons itself out in life, or the person can choose later on in life. But it is a chromosomal abnormality. And most intersex people, according to most recent research, don't want anything to do with the LGBTI community at all. Now, the question I'm asked most is, how can I get my child away from this ideology? But after that, the question usually is, but how did it even get into schools in the first place? So I thought I would ask Kat Karena. Kat has been working in this space for a long period of time. Kat hosts several websites on this issue, and one specifically for parents, and those web addresses will be on the episode notes. She's a New Zealander, and New Zealand has been doing a lot of work in this, and started Resist Gender Education New Zealand. And I thought I would ask her how and when this first started.
In 2011, I looked at all the laws that had the word sex in it. And what I found interesting, after 2011, they were changing the word sex to gender. But then what happened is they changed the meaning of gender. So they managed to hijack all these laws to mean something completely different because they changed that one word to gender.
Okay, so that's in general language, but how did it get into the education space?
I'm sorry, but a lot of this actually came out of the education space. People who wanted to have social change and social justice and had all these ideas. And it's based around heteronormativity. So people like Ross Ward from La Trobe University and 3 others wrote the program, Safe Schools program. Have you heard of that?
Yes, almost certainly. It's been banned in New South Wales. I think it still goes occasionally in Victoria, doesn't it?
You think it's banned, but I've been working on the sex and gender guidelines, and what we found is it's been relabelled. It's still being taught. So it's been relabeled.
Yeah.
So Ros Ward is the main writer of that, and she admitted in the Marxist conference in 2015 that though it was purported to be an anti-bullying campaign for LGBTQIA, she admitted that it actually had nothing to do with assault. It was to go against heteronormativity. So from a Marxist point of view, the people who've got all the power are heterosexuals. And what they want to do is they want to normalize all other sexualities. And when I'm talking about all other sexualities, I'm not talking about just gay or bisexual. I'm talking about any sexuality, bestiality, pedophilia, BDSM, all to be normal and accepted and all to be taught from zero age up. If you notice recently, WHO have been putting guidelines out in Europe for sexual training from zero age up, but we've got that in our curriculum material too. Have been written mainly and influenced by trans activists.
Okay, so they're against heteronormativity, which is just being normal heterosexual. The World Health Organization are involved, but is there any science behind it at all?
They're getting most of their ideas from Alfred Kinsey, and Alfred Kinsey believed that sex was just like any other biological urge. It had nothing to do with social norms or making people connected with each other or anything like that. It was just like eating. And he believed that everybody from zero age and up was sexual. He was quite a monster. His ideas have been accepted across many different education platforms, but they're behind a lot of what's coming in the curriculum.
But this has happened on a worldwide basis, Kat. How did it get to be so global?
At this point, I'm going to start at something that's called the Denton's Handbook. Have you heard of the Denton's Handbook before?
I have, and I think it's something listeners might be interested in.
Okay. The real name of it is actually, it's a manual put together. It's an advocacy handbook, a transgender diverse advocacy handbook. And it's called Only Adults, Good Practices in Legal Gender Recognition for Youth. And it was a collaboration between Denton's, which is the biggest law firm in the world. They're every single place. They're lawyers for Stryker, global pharmaceutical companies. The book was to give social justice warriors the 8 to 9 common goals they needed to pursue in every single country to bring about the laws that they want to embed gender identity ideology.
So this Denton's Handbook specifically targets youth, and it's meant for social justice activists in order to use that to get the best results. How about we go through them sort of one by one and look at the implications for parents and teachers, and of course the implications for the students. What was the first one?
Self-ID, which means no requirement for sterilisation, surgical, medical treatment or diagnosis for adults.
So self-ID, this is what the gay independent politician Alex Greenwich for New South Wales is trying to introduce. So that's for adults, and I guess coming on from that, kids would be able to self-ID as the other gender, or indeed sometimes as a cat. What's number 2?
They wanted to make sure that all gender affirmation treatments were swift and affordable. They have nothing to pay, and this is also the legal process of gender identity recognition.
So a student at school, a child at school who believes that they are in the wrong body, the other gender, the affirmation has got to be quick. They start them on the puberty blockers quickly, and then onto the hormones. But surely then parents would have a say in it all.
They want to make sure minors remove the parental consent to any medical and social transitioning so the parents didn't get a say. So
for parents, they wanted to exclude you from the decision-making process.
And they also want to remove the age of sex, to have sex for children.
So no age of consent, and this gets back to the Michael Foucault philosophies of the 1970s and 80s, that kids can have a sexual life with adults.
They also want to remove the whole idea of there being sex. So you didn't have sex on the birth certificate. Legally, you wouldn't have a boy or a girl. You would only have gender. And they would have to try to find out what their gender was, their gender identity was. They also wanted to bring in a third gender, which is basically, it turns out to be non-binary, where you're neither male or female or anything.
So this is also what Alex Greenwich is talking about introducing, I believe.
And they also, most importantly, they recognise the need to bring in extreme sanctions for breaching any law related to gender recognition or gender identity or gender affirming care.
So at school, if a parent says, no, I do not believe my daughter is going to be transitioning to a boy, if you are stopping that affirming process, that can be against the law and the child can be removed from the parent. Now, Kat, most sane people would think that this is just madness. How did it manage to get such reach into society and into schools?
I'm going to jump onto Thomson Reuters. They brought them in because they're the marketing arm of the organisation. They are the ones that help them to how to bring this about. They said, you've got to take action quickly. So if there's any kind of political momentum, jump on it, carpe diem. Work with other LGBTQI organisations, international trans rights organisations. They said when you campaign, target youth politicians, youthful politicians, target, LGBT politicians. Use human rights as a campaign point always. So trans rights are human rights. Everything is about its human rights.
And this is what parents you will find in schools. They're talking about this whole gender identity thing as being a human right. So it's the human right of the boy who's transitioned to a girl to use the girls' toilets. So what else did they say?
Try to make it so that you don't let people think that when you're transitioning children, it's got anything to do with medical. Focus instead on messages like being their authentic self. So in defense of children, I do say go there because we've made it simple of what the students, if you click on the student tab, you'll see what the students have been taught from K1 to K12 in one page, made it really simple. What teachers have been told they have to taught, made that simple, parents. And then we've got underneath resources, school resources, we've got an alternative to the sex and gender guidelines per state.
Look, Kat just mentioned a website, a bit hard to get just jotted down, so we'll have it in the episode notes. So you go to the episode, you can press play, but you can also scroll down to more, and you'll be able to go to Kat's In Defence of Children website. Now, Kat, I think parents would be sniffing the dangers now from what you've said, the dangers to their kids. But what's the end game for society?
All these things, issues of self-ID and sanctions and etc. All of that together will queer culture. Overseas, where it's gone a bit further than us, like in Norway, a woman was brought to face 5 years jail for saying men cannot be women. So you have got state overreach where the state has more say over your child than you do. You've got ties to pedophilia, you've got a state-sanctioned ideology, you've got university school indoctrination, you've got transhumanism, authoritarianism, female erasure, state over family, and what the key thing is removal of objective truth.
Wow, that was Kat Karena, and all her websites will be on the episode notes for this episode 33. Pretty difficult listening, isn't it? It's like it's some sort of big conspiracy, although, it is crazy enough to be a conspiracy, but it's not. It's in our schools, it's in our universities, it's in our health departments, it's in government, it's certainly in councils. It's everywhere. But what can parents do to minimise the impact of this ideology on their kids? I mentioned in the introduction there was a day coming up, September 14th, called Unteach the Overreach, which is an international day of action for parents and against the teaching of gender ideology in schools. Now, I know that it's very difficult for parents to remove the kids from school for the day because the parents have to work, but there are other things that can be done. And I managed to talk with Rae Clark. Now, Rae started a website and an organisation called Stop Gender Education Australia. And the website is stopgendereducation.au. And I began by asking her what first sparked her concern about gender ideology in schools.
Phil, I have three children. They're 21, 17 and 15. We're in Melbourne. And I noticed a real shift from my eldest to my youngest, even from my middle one to my youngest. I noticed that my youngest wasn't comfortable with debate and with different ideas. Now, we're a family. We eat dinner together most nights at our dinner table. It's always passionate discussion. It's always been a time when we talk about world and current events. And my kids have grown up seeing robust debate and discussion around the table. And there were two things I noticed up front. The first, I guess, was both of my daughters, but especially my youngest, they were changing their language. So they were talking about other girls as they, and even when it was a singular girl, and I was really confused. And their reaction then to me being confused, and then when I worked out what was going on a rant about it's a misuse of grammar and we shouldn't corrupt the English language, which was not even from a thoughtful perspective. It was just a reaction to how difficult and confusing I found the language. They were very judgmental, and they couldn't maintain the idea of a discussion about it. I found that really concerning. And then I started to notice that my youngest was unwilling to engage on any topics where she would have a different view to us or to me. And she saw not just my views, but me as a person in a very negative light. And I started doing some digging in terms of, well, where's this coming from? And I started really looking at material that they're doing at school, which is called respectful relationships.
So all of this change in behaviour that you saw with your children, you think it came from that?
I really do, yeah. It's a program that's been embedded across the curriculum. It was introduced in 2016, so my youngest was only 8 then, and I think it's taken a while to ramp up, but it's certainly ramped up now. They've linked it across the curriculum to, every area, also health, but they've even linked it to English. And when the kids are getting this all day, every day, and just getting a specific viewpoint, we very much saw it shaping them.
So in this respectful relationships, are they portraying these views as being sort of widely accepted, and this is what people now accept and this is the way they see things?
Yeah, they're only presenting that there's one way of viewing things. So they're modelling that being respectful looks like X, and there's only one way. And so, for example, that includes you must respect somebody's gender identity. And there's no modelling, there's no teaching around different views and values and how you could respectfully show a difference of opinion.
So what exactly is this respectful relationships thing?
Yeah, so respectful relationship is marketed as a violence prevention program. So they'll describe it as evidence-based and developed by experts. And the other one they like to say is it's age-appropriate. It's none of those things, and parents need to know that. What it is it's a very well-funded effort to disrupt cis heteronormativity.
What is that?
So that's a slur that they basically apply to anyone who's normal. So, the cultural norms. So they want to disrupt, and their own documents talk about that.
Yes, Karena talked about this earlier on. It's like a fight against the normal.
That they think that the gender is only the same as their sex because society has deemed it that way, and that we're programming little boys to boys to grow up to be men and little girls to grow up to be women, that's not a function of natural order. It's a function of power and social construct and needs to be turned on its head.
So this gets down to the philosophies of Michael Foucault back in the 80s.
Yeah, Michael Foucault, Judith Butler, they're all referenced in the respectful relationships material. Yeah. Now, respectful relationships creates numerous threads which are damaging for children. I could go on forever, but I guess as an overview, look, it confuses language. So it mixes up male and female as being gender identity versus sex. It mixes up gender and sex constantly, so it just creates confusion. It destabilises kids' sense of self, which leads to isolation, and that also leads to destruction of our relationships. And look, the name respectful relationship sounds nice superficially, but I see it as actually being about regulating and dictating human relationships. Now, in Victoria, parents might hear it called resilience, rights and respectful relationship, or the 4Rs, but it is now, it's in the national curriculum now, Australian curriculum, and the Victorian material, which has been incredibly well funded. There's even an Australian website for it. It's been released under Common Commons license. Every school can use it, and even the external groups like Talking the Talk, Sex Ed and so on, they can use it and build on it.
Can parents get this and read it themselves?
Yeah, they can, and it's really worth doing. So you can get it on the Victorian website, and there's also an Australian website for it, which I'll provide to you so you can put it in the show notes.
Yep.
The thing to know about it is, so what they've done in Victoria is they've prepared 7 booklets. So there's one for foundation, and then after that there's one for every 2 years. So year 1, 2, year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so on. And they're huge. Some of them are huge. So most of them are around 80 pages. Some are up to 150. So it's a lot to work through. We're doing a lot of analysis of it and sort of putting together 2-page overviews. Parents know what are the key problems with it, what to look at. Because it's a government document, on the surface, when you read it, you might go, sort of seems okay, but there's something a bit off. And so we've done a lot of work on, analysing the scenarios, counting how many times parents are shown as being the problem, counting how many times gender and sex are mixed up, things like that, really trying to zoom in and make it clear what's going on under the surface.
What are they saying, that kids are born in the wrong body and they've got sort of the wrong body parts attached to them? Are they going that far?
Yeah, look, let me give you some specifics. So there's kind of 3 really big things I'll talk about. So one is they really push that parents are bad, but teachers are trusted and school is safe. And we see this they don't say it explicitly, but in terms of how often they present a scenario where the parent's the problem, and then how often an activity suggests that you go to the teacher for help.
So this is what you saw in your daughters, wasn't it? You saw that they were not relating to you.
Yes. And look, this is the opposite of safeguarding. All child practice knows that children do best with their families and that the family relationship should be promoted above all else. Respectful relationships does not do that. It actually undermines it. Now, the second thing, which is what you were sort of asking me about, is gender identity is embedded throughout, and they do this in several ways. So they mix up sex and gender repeatedly and use them each in the wrong context despite the way that they've defined them. They downplay biology, so they really focus on the lack of differences. So they'll, for instance, with the little E's in year 1 and 2, they'll do games where there is no difference between boys and girls. And then they talk about, so there is no difference and sex doesn't matter. And you can see that then build, say, when you get to year 5 or 6, where they give you a story of 2 so-called girls in the same sports team and using the same toilet, and one girl's upset, and it turns out that the other girl is actually a boy. And the example has the true girl, the female, being castigated for being mean, and there's no discussion of that there is a difference. The kids are taught, who's the bully, who's the bystander. There's no discussion of, well, what else could she have done? How could different people's rights be respected? And they actually have activities which encourage kids to explore their gender identity. There's one which they're encouraged to look at transgender role models, and they can act out being a transgender role model.
So hold on. So a 10-year-old can be asked to act out a transgender role model or read about them. Is that right?
Yes, so some of the year 5 kids would still be 10, so yes, that's right. And yeah, look, it introduces language like definitely body parts. We start seeing that in year 1 and 2, and they start talking about born with. So body parts are they're sort of relegated to being historical artefacts, it's just something you're born with. And then in year 5, we see born in the wrong body come in. Year 7, they use sex assigned at birth. So all terms which very much are used by the transgender industry.
So it's not science. It's certainly not biology. It's anti both of those things. It's simply an ideology like a religion, like a cult.
Yeah, and it downplays the fact that sex is an important factor in identity development, that sex affects emotional, social, physical development. And it really downplays that and just makes it, it's something that you were born with that doesn't have any relevance later on. And then because it makes it body parts, when you get to year 5 and 6, there's actually an activity called the gender machine, and they construct gender. So you can see for very concrete thinkers how it would be very easy to get mixed up and to think, well, I can just change my body parts.
Well, it certainly downplays the fact that sex is integral to the survival of our species.
Marking the Role is funded entirely by subscriptions and donations. You can subscribe via our Substack, or you can buy us a coffee via our Buy Me a Coffee page. Just go to the links in the episode notes to subscribe or donate. Subscription is $35 for the year, or you can buy us a coffee for as little as $5. Thanks for listening.
How is this thing funded?
So the funding is really interesting. I've tracked $300 million since 2009, $280 million in the last 8 years. And that's not all of it. That's just what I found so far, with most of that being Commonwealth and Victoria. Now, what that money means, a couple of things. A, you've got these booklets for each year group, which are incredible. So if you go on to sports or language or English, you won't see anything like this. The level of detail gives the teachers lesson plans of what to teach, and it's helpfully mapped to curriculum areas for them, so that then if they are audited by any of the curriculum authorities, they can show how they're meeting curriculum outcomes. So one is they've resourced it. The second is there's been significant funding provided to schools to enable them to upskill their teachers. So every year, schools can apply for funding. This year, it's $10,000 per school to have teachers do the training. So what's happening is, particularly in primary schools, this is being delivered by the classroom teacher usually. And so it's happening not sort of externally from somebody that the kids don't know, but it's being embedded in other lessons with a teacher that they have real relationships with.
So hold on. The teachers are being taught about this. Is every teacher in the school perhaps, and then they are going into the classroom and indoctrinating their students, the kids, on this. So it's coming from someone that the kids admire. But my understanding is that most teachers think a lot of this is rubbish. That yes, sure, the consent stuff is good, and there's a lot of the respect stuff is good, but teachers think that all the gender ideology stuff is just over the top.
So I've heard anecdotally a lot of teachers don't do the more extreme stuff. They're just not comfortable with it, so they skim over those areas. But even the less extreme things like body parts and the transgender role model stuff, even just some games which minimise sex differences in level 1, 2, it doesn't sound problematic, right? And if you're just a year 1, 2 teacher and you haven't sort of joined the dots to how this is then built on later on, it can seem like a good thing. So superficially, it ticks some boxes. Then you've got a well-funded campaign to train teachers, and it also allows schools to say, well, we're meeting our child-safe criteria. This is part of our well-being program. So many well-meaning teachers will think they're doing the right thing.
It's a bit like the new history curriculum, where if you ask a parent, look, your child's going to learn history, is that okay with you? And they'll go, yeah, of course, history is really important. But then you look at the history curriculum and see that Captain Phillip is mentioned once, Captain Cook is not mentioned at all. And you think, oh, okay, I should have checked on that detail in the history curriculum, the fact that Indigenous and Aboriginal is mentioned 156 times in the curriculum. So it's really parents' responsibility to look down at that detail, you're saying?
Look, it's unfortunate because I don't think it should need to be, but that's the reality of where we are, that we can't trust schools to make these value judgments. They've determined that this is age appropriate and that this is what respectful looks like, and that's just not consistent with many families' views.
And as you said before, this is happening from kindergarten. This is not just a high school thing. It's happening from kindy.
Oh, absolutely. And they're doing an update at the moment. I sat in on a parent consultation, and they showed us the Year 1 material, which is teaching the children how to introduce themselves. And they teach them that it's respectful to introduce yourself as, my name's this, and you can refer to me this. What's your name, and how would you like me to refer to you by? And by that, they give the example of pronouns, and they say this is just basic respect.
Ray, on introducing this episode, I had a recording from Rye School in England, where a child was identifying as a cat, and the teacher then backed that girl up and was very angry at the other students for not believing that she was a cat and refusing to use the cat pronoun, whatever that is. So you're saying that this sort of education is happening in schools right from the very start?
Yeah, it is. And I heard that too. And I think it's the very rare student that would actually have that conversation with the teacher. A lot of children whose parents I've spoken to, even those whose parents speak to them about this and they have different views, they know it would be social suicide to express a counter view, because there's no way to have respectful contradictory views. There's only one view that's allowed, and if you don't have it, you're a bigot. And if you're a parent and you are concerned about respectful relationships, you need to be prepared, I think, for the straw man, which is, well, you don't understand that domestic violence is a really big problem and we need to prevent it. Now, that's ridiculous. Of course, domestic violence is a huge problem. There's no evidence that school-wide programs can prevent it. And there is evidence that they're harmful. We've got some information about that on our website. And certainly in Victoria, we've seen the rate of violence between children, increase since respectful relationships was introduced. But the argument that you don't think domestic violence is important, be prepared for it so that you can just bat it back. Don't be surprised.
Now, are there any states that are worse than others? You've mentioned Victoria's really bad, but I've had a couple of emails saying that Queensland is really bad with this.
Yeah, so look, in 2010, respectful relationships education was introduced into the health and PE stream of the Australian curriculum. So, and many of our states use the Australian curriculum. There was a report done in 2021 by Monash Uni, which is it's an overview of all these programs in Australia, and it makes for pretty concerning reading. And they hold Victoria's program out as being the best, as being the most gender transformative. And I know, and it's the one that's held out. Now, since then, we've seen Queensland ramp theirs up. I think the reason why Victoria's had the biggest effect is because it's the best funded. And so therefore, it's proudly on the government's website. 100% of government schools are doing it. They've also, the money I said that they made available to train teachers, they've made it available to private and Catholic schools as well. So there's something like over 400 independent schools and Catholic schools that are also teaching it.
Now, I don't expect you to comment on this, Ray, but could it be so well funded in Victoria because Melbourne has the Royal Children's Hospital, and that hospital has the country's biggest gender service? I wonder. Ray, how can a parent find out what's going to be taught to their child at school?
Yeah, look, Phil, that's a great question because that's actually the first thing that parents need to do. In Victoria, it's all available online if your kid's at a public school, and I believe it's the same in most states. So on our website, certainly for respectful relationships, we have a table which has the links to where the teaching materials that are used for respectful relationships in state schools for each state. Now, some schools will outsource it. They'll use groups like Minus 18 or Talking the Talk Sex Ed or whatever else. What seems to occur at most schools is if they have an external group in, they seem to be very good about letting parents know. They'll put something in the newsletter and say, oh, we're having this group, they're experts, they've got age-appropriate material. If you have any concerns or you want to know what they're doing, you can let us know. And because they're so upfront about it, I think most parents go, all right, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'd say is when you see that, jump on it. Say, great, thank you. Yes, I'd like to see it.
Do you think some of these external groups like Minus 18 are presenting the full story to the parents?
Now, when it's an external group, one of the things that parents have found is sometimes they'll get a special presentation. It's been prepared for parents. It's not what's being shown to the children. So you want to see, well, what's being given in the classroom? What about the worksheets and the crosswords and the colouring ins and blah, blah, blah? And a number of parents have got, well, it's copyright. So in that situation, our advice is, well, say, no problems, I don't need a copy, but can I please come in and have a look at it? Now, if they're not willing to show you, I think it's quite simple. You simply say, well, no, my kid can't do it. But ideally, they'll say, sure, come in and have a look. And when you go in, there's a few, especially if you're confronted by 100 pages, or just look for the things that you know are concerning for you. Does it mix up sex and gender? Does it promote gender identity? Does it promote concepts that you just think are not age appropriate for your kid? You know, talking to primary school age children about sexuality, many children just aren't ready for that.
So you're saying, Rae, that look for the key words like identity, like gender and sex sort of being mixed up. That sort of key word.
And look for how parents are portrayed. Look for parents, if parents are even in there, or if parents are missing, and it's all about, like, who are the trusted people that are presented as helping kids solve problems? Because you really want your kids to have modelled to you, certainly until late adolescence, that, you know, you're a primary key person to assist with problem solving.
Now, Rae, investigating all this takes a lot of time and a lot of energy from parents, I'd imagine.
Now, it is quite a bit of work. We're trying to help with that. So for Victoria, we have 2-page overviews that we've prepared for the Respectful Relationships material. And we've also prepared some letters to help you have your child removed, which I can talk about. But in those, there's a table for each grade. It links those to the harms that we've identified. Now, we'd love to do the same for every state. So any parents listening who would like to help, reach out. We can help hold your hand to know what to do and how to go about it. But if you do your state, it will help every other parent in your state.
Is there anything for New South Wales parents there?
There's an opt-out letter, but there's nothing yet that reviews the material to help parents know. So we do have a link to the Respectful Relationship used in New South Wales government schools, but we don't have a review yet.
Okay, so there's an opt-out form, though, for parents.
There's an opt-out form, and it requires parents, in order to use it, they need to actually distill down what it is they want to opt out of. So if they want to use that letter, it would be great if they can then share with us what they've distilled down and written so that they can opt out of it.
Look, from my reading, the documents that have been prepared are developed by experts in the field, mainly from academics. Are they really experts?
Well, many of them are experts in sociology or queer theory or post-structuralism. What they're not is experts in child development. So the lead author of the Victorian Respectful Relationships material, she recently confirmed that they've not had the material reviewed by a developmental psychologist, and that they have no longitudinal data.
So a psychologist has not looked at this stuff and said, oh, look, it's not really suitable for year 10s and gee, this could be, this scenario could be causing them to have bad dreams at night. Nothing like that.
Well, not a developmental psychologist, which was what we asked about, because, you know, developmental psychologists are particularly concerned with what's appropriate for different stages of development. So to give you an idea of these experts, I recently saw an article in the Melbourne Age, which is one of our daily broadsheets, and it quoted one of these external experts named Vanessa Hamilton of Talking Sex. And she was quoted as saying, "There is no such thing as too young. People say they'll lose their innocence if we tell them too young. But that implies learning about human sexuality is wrong, shameful, harmful, bad, or taboo." So clearly there's no awareness there of a child's cognitive, emotional and developmental readiness. And, you know, by her rationale, calculus must be wrong and shameful because we don't teach kindergarten children about calculus.
Yes, so why isn't Einstein introduced in year 1?
Exactly, clearly because he's shameful. And
dear. Yeah, look, my experience in universities and academia is that these academics really have their head in the clouds, and they're very big on the philosophy of it all. But many of them don't even have children. They wouldn't know what a child is capable of doing.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think it's about funding grants. So I've traced several $1 million in ARC grants, which is the Australian Research Grants. Michael Flood was behind a lot of this. He alone has attracted $2.3 million in funding.
Oh no!
And
I used to know. Now I'll just stop there for a second, because at this stage of the interview I had an apoplexy, because the name Michael Flood triggered me terribly. When my first book came out in 1998, a book on fatherhood called The Fatherload, I argued that dads and mums were equal but different, that mums could do things dads couldn't do, like breastfeed, and dads could do some other things like protect the child in physical activity. So at that time, Flood was preaching the transgender stuff. This is 1998. So we locked horns. So that's why I had a reaction to that name. We didn't get along.
So Michael started this in 2007 with a paper for Vic Health, right? So he was the first. And so the academics, and I've been working on, you've got academics from Melbourne, from La Trobe, from Deakin, from Monash. All of the Melbourne unis seem to have got a look in. They're getting funding for doing it. And the academics will go wherever the funding is. And we've had, so this was introduced when we had Labor governments in power nationally in the Commonwealth. And it's been really pushed by the Victorian government, which has had Labor governments for the last, I think it's 8 years. So that's where the money is.
If we go back to the classroom for a sec, I know that the classroom teacher or a teacher from the school has to sit in New South Wales in these sessions. I'm not sure about other states, but in New South Wales that a teacher from the school has to sit in on them. But do you think it's worthwhile a parent asking to sit in on them?
Look, I've not heard of this occurring, and I doubt many teachers or schools would allow it. So it's not just what's in the materials, it's the conversations that the material opens the door to, and that's why you'd want to sit in, because these are conversations you don't want an adult outside your family to be having with your child. I think you can get enough of an inference from looking at the materials to say, well, I don't want my kid anywhere near an environment where I can imagine what sort of conversations could be held, the door open to. Why would I want my kid to be in there? I don't need to go in to hear it.
So what can a parent do? Okay, they can go to stopgendereducation.au, and you've got lots of information there. But what can a parent do if they are concerned about this content?
We're pushing a 3-step process, which is look, set, tell. So look at what your child's being taught. That's the first step. And we've talked a bit about that. And on our website, we've got quite a bit of information to help you get started. The second step is to set boundaries. So set boundaries for what's okay for your child to be taught. So there's a requirement on schools to teach certain things. It doesn't mean that it has to be taught to your child. You're the parent, you set the boundaries, you determine what's controversial for you, what you think is harmful for your child, what is incompatible with your beliefs and values. So once you've looked at it and worked out what they're teaching, then you can set the boundaries. And then the third step is tell school what those boundaries are, what's off limits for your child.
Okay, but this is where some parents are going to confront a hurdle, because how do you actually tell the school? Do you go up and tell the principal? Do you write a letter? What's the best way to do it?
It depends on the school, and it depends on the state, and it depends on what it is. So, for example, Victoria, if it's sex ed, the policy is you can simply opt out. They don't have to ask you, but you can just write and say, don't want them doing sex ed. So that's super easy. If it's respectful relationships, which they've got in via, far more sort of embedded methods, it's a bit more difficult. And so this is where most states will have a policy that will be something along the lines of controversial materials. And it's about teaching materials that might be controversial for some families and how the school deals with that. And they'll typically take the same approach, which is where you have to show that it's controversial for your family and why you think it's harmful for your child.
Now, for New South Wales parents, the 2023 guidance for the Department of Education says that parents and carers need to be advised of the specific details of school activities, programs or events addressing controversial issues and the relevance to the curriculum and school programs and activities. Where advice is appropriate, it says, you must be given prior information so parents and carers can provide consent or withdraw their child from a particular session on controversial issues. And the next sentence is the most important. It says, the parental right to withdraw their child must be respected. Now, Rae, if a parent withdraws their child from a session or a class, do they have to do other work? Like, does the school have to provide other content for them?
The schools are supposed to provide an alternative teaching material. My personal view is, look, your goal here as a parent is to protect your child. And how do we protect him or her? And that's getting them out of those classes. And if that means they're sitting in the library reading a book and missing out on the games that the other kids are doing, yeah, that's unfortunate. But you know what? That's better than them being in that class.
And principals are very, very busy. And to get into the argy-bargy of this is not what they want either. They want an easy solution, and simply excusing the child is the easiest. Do you think it helps if a parent has a friend to go with who's a like thinker? Because I've heard of some parents being labelled as a transphobe because they don't want some of this education. Does it help if you have a couple to be in support?
I think the real advantage of having a friend is actually if it's a friend with a child in the same class, because then your child has a peer in the library.
Yeah.
Because I think, we're adults, right? We can put up with
Yes,
it.
good point.
But for the kids that's in the library when their other friends are doing games that seem innocuous, because a lot of the games, they do, what's the time, Mr. Wolf, for Sleeping Giants, but they turn it around so it's got a little hidden message. But, they're fun. And you need to be explaining to your child why you're making this decision, that this is what some people think and this is why it's problematic. But for them to have a buddy to go with would be ideal.
So you might have one or two other parents and so your child will have other children to be with in the library. But what is the most important point to push when you talk with the head of wellbeing or the principal?
You've got to be really careful how you do it. And if you go in with a general complaint that's about wanting to change the program, then the risk is it won't be dealt with under controversial teaching materials, and the principal can just put it in the general complaints pile. What you want is that it's dealt with. So therefore it has to be specific to the kid, and it's got to be about the harms to the kid. And if you focus on the harms that this is going to cause to your child, the principal has to do something.
Yeah, look, this is really important part of this episode. So for parents listening, you don't come out and go, oh, this philosophy is silly. What you do is focus on the harm that is being done to your child. Is that right?
That's right. And so long as you're specific and it's about the harms, then they have to deal with it under this policy. And if you're going to be a nice compliant parent and say, look, it's fine for my kid to go to the library and read a book, then the path of least resistance for that principal is to say, fine, your child can go to the library and read a book.
Now, as a final question, Rae, a lot of parents are thinking, should I discuss this with my child? Yes, I can investigate it. I can set my rules and I can act and do that. But should I talk to my child about it and say, look, Johnny, I'm a bit concerned about what Miss Smith is talking about in the classroom. Can you just let me know what's happening if you hear these words mentioned? Do you have that sort of discussion with your child?
Yeah, Phil, I think that's really important. So we've got our model for schools, which is look, set, tell, and look at the content, set boundaries, tell school. But the other plank of it is to prepare your child. There's conversations you should have with your child, so you're pre-preparing them for the sorts of things they might hear and what you think about them and why, and modelling different ways to be respectful and kind and loving towards people with different views, but not accepting those views because they're different to what we believe in our family. Some of the examples that I've heard of parents doing is that they teach their children that if certain conversations that a teacher might have, and I can give you examples, that their response needs to be to tell the teacher that their parents don't want them to be involved in these discussions. And if the teacher doesn't stop, to go to say, look, my mum wants me to go to the principal's office if this is discussed, and not to leave the principal's office until the principal calls mum or dad.
So you equip them with the exact language that they can use.
So yes, you equip them with response, so a formula response, and you also equip them with what to watch out for. And that will be different for different families. But things like, if there's any example of, well, you can't tell if somebody's a boy or a girl, or somebody can be a boy on the outside, a girl on the inside, or, well, some people can be born in the wrong body, that those are all conversations which a child should be empowered to say, look, my family have different views about that. This is something that my parents do not want me being taught about at school, because it's hard for some children to put their hands up and, stand out. So the other thing is to write to the teacher and say, this is what I've done with my child. My child isn't going to want to approach you in front of their other peers. So they're going to approach you by saying, excuse me, Miss Smith, this is the topic. This is one of those topics my mum emailed you about. May I please go to the principal's office? I need to go to the principal's office. They're not asking for permission. They're just going, and you're giving them permission. And if enough children do that, that will get the message through to schools. But it's teaching your kid, and your kid. There's some children that will be more comfortable speaking up in front of the others. But if you make yourself the culprit, my mum isn't happy, mum's the problem, and that gives the kids an out, which is great. My mum's not happy for me to be taught this. I need to leave the classroom now.
Yeah, and even do you think having it on a little bit of laminated paper, like a little card that the child can get up and simply give it to the teacher? The teacher doesn't have to respond, and then they just leave the room. It's like they're giving the teacher a little yellow card, and there's no discussion at all. Nothing needs to be said.
That's actually a really great suggestion, Phil. And I think emailing a copy of it to the teacher at first, saying, I've given this to my child, if they show you this, you'll know. And if your kid has it on their desk or in their pencil case, it helps if they're just not sure, and it's just a reminder every day.
And that little card is signed by the parent. So the teacher can't say, oh, Johnny, get that card off your desk. And that is simply used whenever the child hears those particular words.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, yes. I think just be flexible about where it sits, if it's on the desk or if it's in the child's pencil case or wherever it is.
Rae, it's been a fascinating discussion. There'll be a lot of parents from other states wanting information about this. What do you suggest they do?
Look, we'd love to have you make contact. Our website is stopgendereducation.au. If you can help us by reviewing the materials in your state and preparing a couple of page overview, we can get that up, and that will help other parents in your state not having to reinvent the wheel. So if you've got a kid in Year 3 and you can do Year 3 in Queensland, sensational. Somebody else could do Year 5 in WA or Year 7 in New South Wales, and so on and so on. If we can prepare 2-page overviews of what parents need to be looking for and what key concerns are, this will really help parents take that first fundamental step of look at what your kid's being taught, so that they can set boundaries and then tell school what's off limits for their kids.
Terrific. Thanks so much for talking to us, Rae.
No problem, Phil.
And that was Rae Clark from Stop Gender Education Australia. And the link to her website, where you can find all of that information that you need, will be in the episode notes. So parents, there's been a lot to digest here. Yes, the teacher in the classroom may be teaching some of this stuff, but according to Rae, teachers are more sensible than that, and they're filtering it out. But it's the external providers like Minus 18, like Elephant Ed, like Empowered Together, who really do some great things. But it's important that you look at the detail, at the case studies, at the colouring in, at exercises that the students have got to do in order to really establish what's going on in those sessions. For senior students, it will be the case studies and the discussion scenarios that you need to take note of. Don't forget, it's Unteach the Overreach on September 14. If you can, leave your child home from school that day as a protest against gender education, although I think mainly that day will really come into its own in a year's time. You've been listening to Marking the Role, episode 33. My name's Phil Dye, and I thought I'll leave you with some words from Karena. I'll see you in a few weeks.
One, what you need to do is put definitions back in law, put male and female back in law. The word gender needs to be replaced with the word sex in the Anti-Discrimination Act, and sex can't be conflated with gender identity in law. So that's a very critical case. Schools teach everyone has an internal sense of gender identity. And of course they teach that gender dysphoria is an identity, and it's not. It's a diagnosable mental condition. And the idea that a child has an authentic identity is a myth, because children are children. They go through a series of identities as they mature. I used to think I was a cat, you know. As adults, we don't treat every declaration our children make as though it's permanent. It's an authentic identity until it's not, because they are children.